YouTube. Today we're going to go through whether fasting is ideal for fat loss. We're going to walk through what fasting is, if it can potentially be used for fat loss. We're going to weigh up the pros and cons of fasting in itself, so you can come to the conclusion if you think fasting is going to be useful for you or not when it comes to dropping body fat. Don't forget, if you do enjoy the video, please drop a like and drop a comment, especially if you have any questions that you want me to answer or further videos that you want me to go through. And please do, if you haven't already, subscribe. Okay, so what is fasting? Fasting is essentially where you have longer periods of not eating, followed by a shorter window where you do eat. So for example, you might have a 16-hour period where you do not eat any food or take in any liquids that include calories. Then you have an 8-hour window where you will then eat and consume calories. Now those are two examples I've just given of a 16-hour fast and an 8-hour window. That's just an example. You don't have to follow those exact hours. People can do different lengths of fasting. You can potentially fast for maybe less time or even longer time. Now, a lot of people use fasting for fat loss. There's a lot of people out there who promote fasting for fat loss. Now, if you follow my videos, you know that I'm not going to promote one method of being better than another necessarily for fat loss, because there's always going to be pros and cons for whatever method you use. Okay, and then we're going to go through that now. But there's one thing we need to understand first and foremost when it comes to fat loss and weight loss, and why then fasting could potentially be useful for fat loss. That first thing we need to remember and understand that a calorie deficit is key for fat loss. Okay, so a calorie deficit is taking in less calories than you are burning, expending. Okay, this needs to be achieved for fat loss to work. Okay, so fasting, is fasting a better way or a way to achieve a calorie deficit? Well, of course you can achieve a calorie deficit through fasting. Okay, if you're still controlling the amount of calories you're having within that shorter window, then yes, of course a calorie deficit can be achieved. Calorie deficit can also be achieved without fasting. So it's not necessarily a fact that fasting is better for creating a calorie deficit and therefore fat loss. However, if you are someone who doesn't particularly track calories down to the T, having a shorter window might favour you in terms of creating a calorie deficit, because let's face it, you have less time to eat. So therefore, you might not have enough time to take your calories past the calorie deficit, and therefore you might find it easier to sustain this calorie deficit from day to day, week to week. However, on the other hand, again, it's going to be very individual dependent. You might be someone that struggles with fasting, and hunger might be so bad up until the point of this small window that you have that you actually consume a lot of food because you're so hungry. If hunger is so high that your eating surpasses what it normally would, and you can still within this window cram in a lot of calories, then again, if you're not tracking food intake, you have the potential to go over this calorie deficit. So it's going to be very individual dependent as to whether fasting is actually going to be favourable for you in terms of creating a calorie deficit. However, the ability to create a calorie deficit is 100% still there. So the ability to create a deficit using fasting is 100% there, yes. So can it be used for fat loss? Yes, it can. Now, let's sort of work through other potential pros and cons. We're going to walk through two in particular, okay? When it comes to fat loss, something we also have to consider is that we want to maintain or retain the muscle mass that we have. Okay, fat loss is dropping the majority of your weight lost from body fat, okay, and therefore retaining muscle mass. So there's going to be two main things that come into play when it comes to retaining muscle mass. One, our protein intake, and two, weight training, okay? We're going to start with protein intake. Now, the main thing you have to consider here with fasting is, one, can you get your adequate daily amount of protein in when you're fasting, when you only have a shorter window to eat, okay? Again, going to be very individual dependent, and again, you probably can get enough protein in within an 8-hour window or however long that window is. You're probably going to have to be on the ball with it, you're probably going to have to plan ahead, you're probably going to have to track it to make sure you're hitting numbers. But you might find it a little harder to get protein in a shorter window rather than having the whole day to fit your adequate amount of protein intake in. So it's something to consider. However, you can probably still manage it. Now, the only issue I would potentially have with fasting and protein intake is that your protein feeding is obviously going to be restricted to an 8-hour, maybe even less window. Okay. When in reality, if we're wanting to, really make sure we're getting as much out of our protein intake as possible, in an ideal world for me, having frequent feedings of protein through the day is much more beneficial for stuff like muscle retention, okay? So if you're only eating in an 8-hour window, you're going to struggle to have frequent feedings throughout the day because for the other 16 hours of that day, you're fasting. So there's definitely pros and cons in terms of protein intake when it comes to fasting. The main, thing to consider with protein is within the day, can you get adequate protein? Okay, which you can probably do for fasting. But like I said, there's going to be those cons of those minor concerns of we can't have frequent feedings through the day. And then secondly, we go on to training. Okay, so like I said, training is also important for retaining muscle mass. Training is giving your body the stimulus that it needs to signal, okay, we need to hold on to muscle mass. Now, when it comes to training in a deficit, the main thing you want to focus on is that stimulus, okay? And therefore is the intensity, the performance of your training. You want to make sure it is of a high enough standard and that you're getting a good enough stimulus, a good enough signal. Now, two things again with what we have to compare with fasting and not fasting. Can you train? Can you still train, get the amount of sessions in through the week, still train at a relatively decent intensity? Potentially. Okay, now again, it's very individual dependent again, because you'll have some people who fast, who can train on an empty stomach and feel absolutely fine, okay? So say you're training relatively shortly after your 8-hour feeding window, your training might be absolutely fine. Even if you're training within that fasting window, but you feel fine on an empty stomach, then again, you might be great. If you can train on an empty stomach with less food intake, then you might be absolutely, fine. That's not an issue. If you're 100% confident you can still train at good enough intensity, then that's great. However, there's probably going to be some individuals who are going to notice drops in performance, drops in training intensity, drops in the stimulus, this signal, because we're potentially not having food intake, calories planned very well around our training. Again, if you're going for a long period of fasting, that's a long period of time, and if training's within that window where you're not going to have decent amount of fuel energy around that session to make sure it is of the highest standard. So once again, if you're making sure you're planning your training very smartly around the eating window, then you might be absolutely fine. And that's what I would suggest when you're fasting, to make sure you're getting the most out of training. But again, it gives the possibility of maybe potentially having some issues with training while we're fasting, because we might not have as much energy, as much fuel to put into that training. So there you have it. Okay, that's the main 3 things you need to consider really when you're going through a fat loss phase and you're considering any sort of diet to follow. So when it comes to fasting, can we use it to create a deficit? Of course we can. And again, some people might find it actually easier to create a deficit through fasting. So you can definitely lose body fat and weight through it. However, can you make sure your protein adequate intake is decent enough? Potentially in that window. Can we make sure protein intake is frequent through the day? Unfortunately, we can't with fasting because we're not eating all day. So that's one potential downfall. Training. Can you make sure your training is of high enough intensity, high enough standard while in a deficit? Yes, if you're smart around planning it around that eating window, but then also we have the potential for it not to be if we potentially can't plan our training around that eating window and we have to have it within the fasting window, we might find a little bit of drops in performance. So it's definitely, again, individual dependent, maybe potentially a bit 50-50 on some of the factors. However, you can definitely use it to drop body fat, yes. In my opinion, especially for me as an individual, it wouldn't be what I would opt towards fat loss, because for me, I think there would be better ways of doing it. But again, everyone's different. And if you think fasting might be a great option for you, then go for it. You might have great success. But at the same time, you might find, as we've spoken about here, there's a couple of issues that might arise. Hopefully you found that helpful. Hopefully that's given you some things to think about, to consider. If you do have any questions, please drop them in the comments. If you did like the video, please drop a like. And again, if you haven't already, please do subscribe.